How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to episode 3 of the Liberation Hour. I hope everybody is doing well out there. I appreciate everybody for their support of the first 2 episodes that we have had. We are back here once again, and man, I've told a couple of people this over the last week, but could I have chosen a crazier time to start this podcast with everything that has gone on around the world? It just seems like every week there's a whole new decade that's of news that's out there with everything going on in the United States, everything going on around the world, and we got a lot more to talk about today. And I'm going to have a couple of guests on this show once again today. But just wanted to start by thanking everybody for all the support so far. I think we're up to 25 subscribers on this channel now. I think I've been average about over 100 views the first couple of videos. So huge thank you to everybody who has taken the time out of their weeks to watch these first couple. I know this one's out a little later than the first 2 have been, but we've it's just been so much going on that it had to take a little bit more time to talk about some of these things. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and basically just jump right into it here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as always, and we're just going to get into the first topic, and that's Biden dropping out. This is huge. The first time that a presidential candidate who was president, who could have ran for their second term, has dropped out since Lyndon B. Johnson back in the 1960s. Biden's decision to drop out crystallized on Sunday. I was actually heading down to a soccer game in the Bay Area, and then I got the news on my way down. Biden's staff knew 1 minute before the public did. This is a story out of the AP. At 1:45 p.m. on Sunday, President Joe Biden's senior staff was notified that he was stepping away from the 2024 race. At 1:46, that message was made public. It was never Biden's intention to leave the race until he decided to step aside on Sunday, and he was all in. His campaign was planning fundraisers and events or setting up travel all over the next few weeks. But even as Biden was publicly dug in and insisting he was staying in the race, he was quietly reflecting on the disaster of the past few weeks, or on the past 3 years of his presidency, and on the scope of his half-century career in politics. There was a lot of things that I saw about Nancy Pelosi and other prominent Democrats really trying to force him out of the race. Of course, a lot of this goes back to that debate performance with Trump a few weeks ago, where he was stumbling all over the place, and it was just a bad look. And his poll numbers drastically dropped since then. And so with him dropping out, he did publicly come out and endorse Kamala Harris as vice president, who at this point is looking like will end up being the Democratic nominee. However, they still have to have the convention in mid-August. And that's actually something I wanted to get into, is I wanted to talk about some of the polling, because we're going to be talking about, how likely is it that that Kamala has a chance against Trump, because Biden was starting to go down, I want to say 4 or 5 points in the polls to Trump. And here are some poll numbers from the nation, along with some poll numbers from some key battleground states. General election, Trump up 1 on Harris, 48-47. That's a New York Times Siena poll. And then we look at some of these battleground states, and even though Trump's leading in these, I'm going to get a little bit more deeper into them. So you can see right here, Arizona, Trump +5. But then if we actually look and see Trump's polls against Biden in some of these states, Kamala is actually performing a lot better against Trump. You can see right here, Arizona, there were multiple polls where Trump was up 7. She's already cut that down a couple of points. In Georgia, Trump +2, 48-46. We go over and we look at Georgia. Trump was +4 on average. Multiple polls actually had him up +5, +6. So much closer for Kamala there. And then we go back over here and we see Michigan, Trump just +1, 46-45. Well, in Michigan against Biden, the last poll that came out, he was up 7. So a lot of progress being made already by Harris and the Democrats on Republican candidate Trump, and we're gonna see what ends up happening. But that's actually why I wanted to bring in a couple of people today to talk about that. So I'm really happy to be joined today on the Liberation Hour. Firstly, I want to bring in Mr. Jackson Tofft. How are you doing, Jackson?
Hi, Aaron. It's a pleasure as always to be back on the show. I know we've only done one, but I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Of course, yes. And I also would like to welcome onto the show Mr. Johnston. How are you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing good, man. How about you?
I'm great, man. It's, like I said, it's just been a really crazy time. Obviously, outside of, paying attention to all this, I've been busy with a lot going on as well. And I know that, you guys have a lot going on in your lives too. But, it's crazy because this is probably, I think a lot of people were looking at this election as what could have potentially been one of the most boring elections out there going into it if it was Trump and Biden. And now it's turned into maybe one of the most, I don't know if exciting is the right word, but intriguing maybe elections of our lifetime up to this point. And that's after all the craziness we had in 2016 and 2020. I wanted to first just get your guys' takes, these polls and Biden dropping out. How did you, when did you kind of learn about Biden dropping out? Do you think it was the right decision? And I guess I'll go ahead and start with that. Do you think it's the right decision for Biden to drop out of this race? Jackson, you can go ahead and go first.
Okay. And I apologize in advance. My connection is kind of spotty, so just let me know if I start looking or anything like that, and I'll see what I can do. So I'm pretty, as the kids like to say, terminally online. So I tend to get these updates and these developments as they happen pretty quickly. Um, I was definitely relieved that Biden dropped out. It was becoming more and more clear by the day that he has significantly declined cognitively, even from where he was in 2020, which was obviously not ideal in the first place, but he's declined even further than that, possibly has Parkinson's, dementia, who knows? So I think it's generally a clear positive for the Democratic Party and their prospects in November. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry,
Okay, great.
Yes, I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I think it's obviously the correct choice for the party. Just about any other generic Democrat polls much better against Trump than Biden was doing as the presumptive nominee up to this point. I think outside of policy, which obviously has the potential to have an impact, especially when you have issues that are issues such as the Gazan genocide being at the forefront of our politics right now and our support of it. But just the simple fact that it's no longer someone who's 80 plus years old, someone who is not cognitively declined, I think is massive boost. And I think you kind of felt this groundswell of energy since he dropped out, even for sort of someone who has the reputation of being a toe the line establishment Democrat, such as Kamala Harris, is sort of, we're seeing this tidal wave of energy and reinvigoration of the Democratic voting blocks. So I think it's a I think that Kamala Harris is necessarily the best candidate and would energize Gen Z and millennials to some other candidates, such as Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Those candidates. Other
Oh, you're cutting out a little bit now. Sorry about that. But no, I totally get your point there of that, like, Kamala isn't necessarily like the best candidate out there, but the fact that she's just not Biden and that she's 20 plus years younger is a huge benefit out there for sure. And it's actually interesting you bring that up because going back to 2020, Kamala, I don't even think she got 1,000 votes. She didn't get a ton of she got like no delegates. She was forced to drop out super early because she was polling so low in the Democratic primary. And now she's out there and it's basically turned into a coin flip of a race like that. And she's raised hundreds of millions of dollars in a span of 48 hours. It's really crazy that, even though she maybe was the worst possible candidate to replace Biden, everybody out there is basically, hey, we just want somebody that has some energy that can beat this guy who's a threat to this country right now, that a lot of people perceive as a threat to this country. So it just shows you, how weak of a candidate Trump is on the Republican side, but also just the pure hatred of Joe Biden and people wanting somebody else other than him to run. And Dylan, that's kind of where I want to bring you in on this is, what do you think? What do you think are some things that Harris and the Democrats need to do if they want to beat out Trump this time around? I don't know if some people say, oh, is the country truly ready for a woman after what we saw with Clinton versus Trump in 2016? Of course, there's a whole corruption side to that argument as well. But overall, just what do you see as some of the biggest things that Kamala needs to do to convince the public that she is the best choice?
Well, there's definitely a few things you can think of there. Um, to be honest, I don't think she's going to have to do a whole lot. I think it's going to be more about her not making mistakes than it is her doing a bunch of good things. I think probably a majority of people who follow politics thought when it was still Trump Biden, if one of them drops out, whoever replaces them is going to win because they're both very polarizing figures for one reason or another. I think if Biden stayed in and Trump dropped out, didn't matter who the Republicans throw in, whoever they throw in probably would beat Biden. So I think it's more of a she doesn't have to screw up thing than it is she has to do a whole bunch of really good things. There's certain things that would help. I think picking a strong vice presidential candidate would do her a lot of good, especially in the Midwest. If she picks one of those Midwestern governors Jackson was referring to, I think that could help her. I've heard the name Mark Kelly floated out there. I could see that being a good move. Um, the Californian in me wanted Newsom to be the one to replace her or replace Biden on the ticket. Um, I don't think Newsom would be the right pick for VP. Constitutionally, I don't even know if it's allowed because they both are from California. I don't think you can do that, but I don't know for sure. But I think a more traditional Democratic candidate would be helpful in that VP slot. And Mark Kelly's pretty well respected, so I could see him being a good choice too. I do want to see her really push out. I really want to see her try to connect with the younger voters. I think millennials and Gen Z are going to be really important in this election for her. It helps that she doesn't seem, and I don't know a whole lot about her stance on this because I don't want to say too much, but just from what I've seen, she doesn't seem to be as pro Israel as Joe Biden is, which will help her, I think. And it seems like she's also a bit more to the left than Biden, which I think will also help her with a lot of younger people who were just going to sit it out because they were just completely dissatisfied with both of the main two choices.
Yeah, and even though she didn't have a super long tenure in the Senate, I was only a couple of few years, I want to say. She was one had one of the most liberal voting records of any senator out there, which was surprising for somebody of her record coming from California, being Attorney General, and having at the time a really bad stance, such as like on the war on drugs and locking a lot of those people up and stuff. And I think a lot of people that are on the left may look at that as a bad thing for sure. But obviously, over time, she has definitely changed her opinion on some of those things, and she actually came out and had a interview. We're recording this on Thursday. Had an interview earlier today, or a press conference, where she talked about meeting with Netanyahu, and it was, even though I don't necessarily see a big change, of course, because I don't think that unless you have somebody out there that's very unrealistic running for the Democratic spot. That it was probably the most stark criticism that I've heard on that issue from anybody out there that's a politician in our country. She was saying like, "Hey, I've made it clear that this is unacceptable. The amount of the humanitarian catastrophe, and that these are the three steps that we need to see if we're going to have a ceasefire." Actually, laying that out, which is something that Biden never did. Now, if that actually happens, I don't know. She's also funded by AIPAC. At the same time, Trump also has very large pro-Israel ties as well. He's definitely would be worse than both of them on that issue. But I just think it's a really interesting thing, and it's interesting you bring up the VP race kind of a little bit there as well, mentioning Newsom and some other guys, because there's other people that have been floated around like Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan, but at the same time, to counteract being a woman of color in this country, I think the Democrats are going to try to go out there and pretty much find the whitest male Democrat possible to probably run and try to, get a lot of the voters. And in my opinion, like, I definitely think you mentioned Mark Kelly. I think there's a possibility for that. At the same time, that is a critical Senate seat out there right now, and a very close Senate race in this country. Jackson, you mentioned somebody that I think would be great, but I think is unrealistic, and that's Tim Walz of Minnesota, maybe the best governor in the entire country with his track record. But I think what's more likely is that you see somebody out there like a Josh Shapiro, maybe from Pennsylvania, who is more pro-Israel in that sense and kind of balances out the playing fields for some Americans that are on the other side, or somebody like an Andy Brashear from Kentucky to try to get some people maybe in that part of the country. And I think that the thing is with all three of those guys, along with guys like Cooper, is you could potentially get some support in the Rust Belt in those states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, the states that Democrats absolutely need to win if they're going to beat Trump in this election. So I think it's something that's going to be very interesting who she chooses for the VP at the convention. And I know a lot of names are floated out there. I want to get your guys' take on this. Who would you like to see be the vice president, and who do you think will end up being the vice president? Jackson, I'll let you go ahead and take a shot on that.
Thank you, Aaron. Sorry for that lapse of connection there. Should be back and good but here, but this whole discussion around who should be the VP and the potential candidates for that is incredibly interesting to me, and it's going to be a very complex sort of risk analysis, cost benefit analysis for the Democrats in terms of who has the potential to get support in a key battleground state that the Democrats are absolutely going to need to win. I've seen a lot of people talk about the winning Pennsylvania is absolutely essential for this election. Same can be said for Kentucky. If you could somehow turn Kentucky blue electorally, that would be big. Arizona, but like you alluded to, like you mentioned, is it worth what's more valuable, keeping Mark Kelly in the Senate or having him be VP, winning Arizona in the presidential race, but potentially having that seat being taken over by the GOP in the Senate? So I think that's very interesting. It's going to be a tough decision. As I mentioned, I think policy-wise, my top two choice, policy-wise, and considering balancing out the woman of color at the top of the ticket and getting a Midwestern white man, from the strategy perspective. But policy-wise and strategy perspective, I would say my top two picks would be Tim Walz, number one, from a policy perspective. He's immaculate record in Minnesota. And then number two, I would say Andy Beshear in Kentucky, just for the prospect of being able to possibly turn Kentucky red and getting one more of those states. I know they don't have a ton of electoral votes, but winning some kind of support in the Rust Belt, I think, would be huge. And then number three for me would probably be J.B. Pritzker from Illinois. I understand he has a pretty good record as well. Really, up and coming star in the Democratic Party. As far as what's the most likely, I do think someone like Josh Shapiro or Mark Kelly is more likely because of their more moderate stances towards Israel and the Gaza conflict, which is so divisive. And I think that though Kamala Harris has signaled in a number of ways that she is going to be more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, which is great. She still has a long way to go before, and a lot of work to do before any substantive change is going to really occur on that. And so I do think that among the Democratic Party top brass, if you will, the Chuck Schumers, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Obama, I think that there is going to be a big hesitancy to go full in on somebody like a Tim Walz. Like you said, it's probably unlikely because of they're viewed as being more extreme, being more leftist, being in the case of Walz, potentially even being to the left of Bernie Sanders. So I think that's going to scare the neoliberals at the top of the party a little bit, and I think it's going to be Shapiro or Mark Kelly.
Yeah, it's been interesting too. You brought up Pritzker, he has a good record for people on the Democratic side, but also at the same time, he might turn off some people who are on the left because of just being a billionaire and having that billionaire status out there as well. So that's a tough issue. Also, obviously, I think a lot of that also kind of rides on how things kind of end up going with this whole Sonia Massey situation, which we'll touch on in the second part of this podcast, being that obviously happened in Illinois and how kind of things come out of that. Even though it's not necessarily all on him when it comes to that, some people might perceive, him in a certain way, depending on, what ends up happening with that case. But Dylan, I want to go ahead and turn it over to you. Same question. Who would you like to see be the VP, and who do you think will likely end up being the VP?
Well, those are two very different questions for me. So in terms of who I would want personally, I'd want someone more to the left of Kamala. Um, like the last election, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. So that's kind of more where my head is at. But in terms of is that realistic or even a good strategy? Probably not, right? So I think it depends on if the party is prioritizing independents or unregistered voters. Like if they're prioritizing winning over independents, they're probably going to go for someone closer to the middle, someone like a Josh Shapiro, for example. Or if I could see them out of left field pulling out someone more progressive, if they really decide that the younger, currently unregistered voters are who they want to go after. Personally, don't think that's the best idea because that's just too much of a wild card. But the Democratic Party doesn't always make the smartest decisions, so that wouldn't totally surprise me. It is encouraging though. I saw something like 300,000 voters just registered within the last week. Like that's pretty encouraging. Um, but I do think it's probably going to be someone who, and it sucks that this is even a thing, but is going to counteract having a black female candidate. Um, I think that's probably going to be a white male, probably from the Midwest, from the Rust Belt, any of those governors. Um, I don't know, just something about my gut is saying it's going to be Shapiro.
Well, it's yeah. What I was gonna say is it's what would have been interesting is if we actually if we had more of a primary process and we actually had multiple candidates throwing their hat out there, what would have happened? I think Kamala still is very likely of what would have happened out of that. I think that she probably would have gotten the support. I will say one person that came to mind when I was thinking of who are people that could replace Biden before he even dropped out, even though I know that it's very unlikely that she ever will run. And I think that she's already kind of stated that she doesn't want to. A person I think immediate would have just been a win overnight would have been if they actually ran Michelle Obama. I don't think that
Oh
it's
yeah.
ever going to happen, or if it
Mhm.
would have happened. But if they went Michelle Obama, I think right then and there, by a snap of a finger, election's over, and I think that she would have won right then and there. Now I think obviously it's it's going to be a bit of a fight, and it's going to be interesting too because I also think that if Trump doesn't win this time around, I really wonder if he decides if he wants to run again in 28 or if he's just done. Because, I think that there's still a major contingent, obviously, of the Republican side out there that is, Trump or bust kind of out there in that sense. But obviously, he's good and up in age, and his son isn't, I don't think, has the same energy that he does. So, eventually, when does the Trump train end and the Republican Party has to shift once again? That's going to be a very interesting thing because both parties are going to kind of be at an impasse here, I think, within the next 4 years of, hey, the Democratic Party is probably going to be forced to go much more left, and the Republican Party is going to be forced to split away from Trump, or they're going to have to find somebody that's going to replace him with that same energy, which is going to be really hard to do. So I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation. I know a lot of people on the Trump side have been unhappy, obviously, with Biden stepping down. They've tried to say that, oh, it's, rigged because of the fact that there wasn't a primary, so that, it was, people, I've heard people saying it's a coup, which in my opinion, that part of it is completely and utterly ridiculous. But like, for example, Trump said on Sunday on social media, he went on a tirade on Truth Social complaining that it was unfair for the Republican Party to have to face a new opponent. And I think the main thing is because they're realizing right now and they're panicking that they have to change their strategy and they're going to have to find dirt on Kamala. And so far, the dirt that they've found and that they've come up with is like very, very minor, small things. And some of them honestly just range on pure and utter, just really gross stuff I've seen on Twitter as well. I definitely think that there's a record you can certainly run. A certain record that she has that you can definitely run against her, but a lot of that means that you're going to have to beat her from the left. And ironically, that's kind of what Trump did with Clinton on a lot of things in 2016. And I just don't know if that's the same Trump that we really have right now, especially with JD Vance now as his VP. Um, but that kind of talks about that, and that kind of actually segues over into the next topic that I wanted to talk about on the show today, and that gets into basically the Republican platform for if they win in 2024. It's called Project 2025. I'll go ahead and talk about this. This is an article from NPR. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And apologies, people, for the delay. Just give me one sec here. There we are. So with just one mention of abortion, Republican Party lays out its 2024 policy platform, dedicated to the quote, to the forgotten men and women of America. The Republican Party's 2024 platform reads like the transcript of a Trump rally speech. The Republican National Committee's platform committee adopted former President Donald Trump's platform, a document that leans into Trump's preferred America First stances and steers away from traditional GOP social issues. And I want to go ahead and touch on some of these here, and then we'll get back and talk about another article here that I have as well. But we'll just go ahead and run through them. So number one, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion. Now, here's the thing, is regardless of personal views on this issue, the issue of immigration, and this is a poll I'm pulling up from Gallup right now, in terms of the question, thinking now about immigrants, that is people who've come here from other countries to live here in the U.S., in your view, should immigration be kept at its present level, increased, or decreased? The number of decreased is at 55%. That number is the highest it has been in this country since 9/11, a poll that was taken a month after 9/11. So the Republican Party has been just hounding and pushing on this issue, and it has been working regardless of personal viewpoint. So that point is something that certainly could get over to the American people. But then we get into some of the other points when it comes to Project 2025. Carrying out the largest deportation operation in American history, make America the dominant energy producer in the world by far. I think a lot of people agree with that, but they, of course, they don't explain how. A lot of the times Trump speaks, he doesn't explain how he's going to do stuff. Stop outsourcing and turn the United States into a manufacturing superpower. Again, there were many jobs that were also outsourced during Trump as well. So, I don't really know exactly how they're going to go about that. They mentioned large tax cuts for workers and no tax on tips. I would argue that that point is brought up so that they can continue paying people $2.13 an hour in red states. So again, the wording of that might look good, but when you actually dive deep into it, it's interesting. And then you actually get into the polling on the minimum wage, and there is a much larger contingent of the American public that would support raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour. Voters right now actually think the average worker needs to earn $26 an hour to have a decent quality of life. And that is a survey of 1,244 people done last year by Data for Progress. And that gets into one other economic thing I wanted to talk about, and then I'll bring you guys in to talk about the first third of this, really, and that's the tax side of this. Basically, Project 2025 would cut the tax brackets into two, essentially, for the marginal income rates. It would make it 15% and 30%. 15% would be the rate for anybody making under $168,600 a year. 30% would be anybody for the rate over that. And then when you actually get into the tax brackets for this year, it essentially ends up being a tax raise on anybody that is making below $383,000 a year. And then it's a tax cut on anybody above that. So when he says he's cutting your taxes, it goes back to the same thing with the Trump tax plan of 2017 or 2018. It was a very temporary thing, but it was something that people saw a lot more harm and hurt over time. And they've seen that today under Biden with, and ever since COVID, and they've blamed it on Biden. But a lot of that can actually go back to Trump. And this would be another case right here of where people might see, a small tax cut in the short term, but then it would be massively increased in the long term. And it's just something that I think that isn't getting reported on enough. And I want to just get your guys', just take on, this Project 2025. I know it's something that has been proposed from the Heritage Foundation for a while. A lot of former Trump staffers that were in his cabinet or in his administration last time around have been some founding fathers of this, for lack of a better term, that have written some chapters in this. And overall, what's your guys' take just on Project 2025? And, do you think that overall the American people are going to respond more favorably or negatively to it? Oh, yeah, I should probably say who's going to go first. Jackson, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Man, there are just so many incredibly disturbing elements of this policy proposal, almost 900 pages. And the more I learn about it, the more unsettled I am that there are people in this country that are proposing and thinking about these kind of policies. For starters, I mean, this goes in accordance with the shift to more authoritarian politics that we've seen on the right recently with Trump and with sort of his development of a cult of personality and alternative facts, so to speak, and with people taking his word, as the gospel in a way. One of the most disturbing elements of this is the replacement of tens of thousands of non-political career civil service workers and replacing them essentially with slots for political appointees, aka political loyalists to Trump, who would have likely fewer qualms about doing his bidding at the expense of the Constitution, at the expense of our democratic institutions. So that's one particularly disturbing element of it. Another thing about that, Trump already issued essentially the same order in 2020 during his sort of lead up to January 6th, or the lead up to January 6th attempt to stay in power, the insurrection, whatever you want to call it. He did issue the same order, but it was never enacted. It wasn't enacted before Biden took office. So Biden took office and, obviously stopped it. But that converting non-political civil service workers to Trump loyalists is incredibly disturbing to me, and gets rid of yet another guardrail and level of oversight on the president, as the Supreme Court already did with their decision on Trump's immunity. Like you said about the taxes, the party who has for so long proclaimed that Democrats want to raise your taxes, they want to regulate government, regulate private industry, and portraying that as big government. Though that same party right now in this in Project 2025 is advocating for policies that would, for a middle-class family with 2 kids and $100,000 of household income, would raise their annual federal income tax by $2,600. As a result of them losing the 10% and 12% brackets, and instead having the flat tax 15% tax rate. If you throw in getting rid of the child tax credit in there, that would bump that up to an additional $6,600 annual dollars of federal income tax for middle class families. And I think a lot of this stems from how ingrained the ideas of Reagan's trickle-down economics are in our society. We have been so propagandized and it's been so ingrained in us that you have to lower taxes for the corporations and the wealthy, and then they will invest that back into higher wages and lower prices, lower costs, right, for the consumers. That is just simply not proven to be true over the 40 years that we've had policies surrounding that idea. So I think the more people look into this, the more they'll realize that it doesn't actually benefit the middle class, doesn't benefit the workers, and instead benefits the 1% and the corporations. But again, like I said, these are very ingrained ideas that we have in our society, and a lot of people simply don't have the media literacy or don't care enough about politics to go into the level of detail required to really undress some of these policies. So.
There we go. Yeah, that's an interesting last point you made, because I think if you actually had to ask people what a marginal tax rate is, I don't think a lot of people would be able to answer that. Same thing goes for a flat tax. The thing that I hear a lot of people, because a lot of people that make the argument against the flat tax would say, hey, like we're saying, it would cut taxes for richer people, it would end up raising them for the poor, and some people would respond to that and say, no, what it'll actually do is it'll get the corporations and the rich people who aren't paying any taxes right now to actually pay them, because it'll be much more streamlined and easier. Well, you know what you just do? You get rid of all the stupid tax loopholes that there already are in the current system, and you actually hire more workers out there to actually go and punish these people for not actually paying their taxes. That's actually what you do, and then you actually should raise it much more. That's another thing too that we talk about when it comes to the economic side of things with this, and just with Trump in general, is that he cut corporate taxes even more than they already were. Corporate taxes were, I think, the highest under either Eisenhower, they were much higher even under Reagan than they are today. And they're so much lower. And he says, oh, that they're like the highest they've ever been. No, when you actually look at the corporate tax rate, it's gone down drastically more and more over the last 50 years. But, staying on this and while still talking about the economic side of things, Dylan, I want to bring you back in. Just what's your take on just the immigration side of this and the economic side of this for Project 2025 and the dangers that it would have on the country?
So, going to the immigration side of things, I like that you brought up that the majority of people think that there should be less immigration, right? So, and I think where the difference is in both parties is how they want to deal with that. Is it seems to me like, and I think Project 2025 confirms it, that at least currently the right wing has no, they don't seem interested in whether or not it's done in an ethical manner, like mass deportations. Obviously, what we had with the kids in the cages during the Trump administration and all of that. Whereas it does seem, at least that I can tell, like a lot of, especially the more kind of centrist Democrats, they also say, hey, there should be less immigration too, but let's figure out a solution that is more ethical, something that doesn't completely leave those people just out in the cold. Because you can't just send everybody back home with nothing. I mean, a lot of these people are leaving places where if they stay there, they're going to die. So, you obviously still have to have the opportunity to claim asylum. And, if it's children that are coming over, I mean, you can't just send a 10-year-old back with nobody. So you can't just mass deport people. Deport, is that even the right word?
Yeah. Mass
Deport.
deport.
I think I put the wrong emphasis on it. Now, going back to Project 2025 as a whole, um, I think that's going to be hugely helpful in getting Kamala elected, just because of how terrifying it is. But granted, that only works if people are aware of it. So one of the big things is making sure people are aware that the Democratic Party pushes that as something to vote against. A lot of, I think, what'll help Kamala is not as much why you should vote for me, more of a why you should vote against Trump. That was pretty much the only play that Biden had, and it wasn't quite working. But because Kamala isn't so hated, I think that could work for her. But going back to Project 2025, so with the stances on abortion, they've pretty much made it so that if you're a woman, it's in your self-interest to vote for Kamala because of just how draconian the 2025 stance on abortion is. So there's things like that are going, that I think help the Democrats if people are aware about it. But if they're not aware about it, it's not going to help. Because if you go back to 2016, a lot of the people who weren't necessarily Trump fans, but who voted for Trump over Clinton thought, well, we don't know exactly what he's going to do. Maybe he'll surround himself with competent people and he'll tone down the rhetoric. But now they're literally putting out a plan of exactly what they want to do, which in a lot of it is pretty horrendous. I mean, so it's hard to say because a lot of it's going to come down to how many people are aware of what's actually in Project 2025 and how many people are willing to look into it instead of just thinking, oh, or it's just the left trying to scare people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And you made a point there of the Democrats are trying just do this maybe through a more humanitarian way in terms of addressing the border crisis or addressing immigration. And I think another thing to make clear is that a lot of times the left gets pointed as wanting open borders, and there's certainly people out there that are more further on the left side that would want open borders. But I think 99% of the standard Democrats are going to be against that and simply just want it done a different way, like you were saying. Obviously, even with Biden and Obama, we still. You mentioned the kids in cages with Trump. We still have had people in facilities that have been locked up even under them as well, and I think that's important to mention. It's obviously also important to mention the reason like we do have borders is because you know we at the end of the day, there's huge issues if we don't have a vetted border with human trafficking. We already have human trafficking issues as it is. There's actually a report out that I saw on PBS back in March where they actually went to the border, and Mexican officials estimate as many as 6,000 people crossing into Mexico every day from nations in Central America, but also countries such as Russia and China. And then a lot of those people who are migrating over there stopped there before continuing their journey over to the U.S. border. So there definitely is an issue with that, and it's a $1 billion business. But again, I think the vast majority of people that are trying to cross over to this country are simply trying to make a better life for themselves and their families, or escape the violence from back home that inevitably also can get tied to the drug war that we have here in America and how it kind of hurts major country, a lot of those Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and then them just trying to escape the poverty or escape the violence in their countries. But I wanted to mention when it comes to this issue that. I think that Trump has been probably much more inhumane on this issue than others. And immigration isn't the only issue where I think that he gets it wrong, and Project 2025 gets it wrong here as well. There are other issues when it comes to spending, such as he says strengthen and modernize our military, making it without question the strongest and most powerful in the world. I'm going to pull this up for you guys so you guys can just see how ridiculous that point is, because we by far already spend much more than other countries. Ever since 1980, defense spending has risen 62%, climbing from $506 billion to $820 billion after adjusting for inflation. And then you can see right here, SIPRI military expenditure database, the United States of America, 39% of all military spending across the world is from the United States. The next country behind it is China at $292 billion. And they basically, you could look right there, they spend more than the next, was that 10 countries combined behind them. So to say like, oh, we need the biggest military, we need to have the strongest military, it's like you're basically saying we need to spend more money on it, and we've continued to spend more and more money every year. One issue regarding spending money that actually I think they get it right, that deviates from I think the Republican platform of the past, is they say fight for and protect Social Security and Medicare with no cuts, including no changes to the retirement age. In this case, it's actually a really savvy, smart political point in Project 2025, because they realize how unpopular cuts in Medicare and Social Security are. Those are the two government programs that consistently across the board between both political parties have said there doesn't need to be any cuts. Screw raising the retirement age. The Republicans who have advocated for raising the retirement age in many states have actually lost their seats because they've tried to run on those points and majorly failed in doing so. But away from just the financial side of things, I want to get into some of the social sides of things with Project 2025 as well. Some of which are just absolutely crazy. Some of which I could obviously see people agreeing with, and I think are much more complicated. So I'll go ahead and start with this. Cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, radical gender ideology, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. Now, here's the thing, right? Obviously, on just a base level, many people are going to agree with a lot of that. The problem is that you allow a lot of people who have a certain ideology to dictate what that means. And then when you actually see some of the books that are actually banned in some of these states, it's actually crazy. So these are books that are banned in Florida, and I have a few from Texas, okay? And this is both states. Anne Frank's diary, I think the graphic version, is banned in Florida and Texas. Okay, that's a very important book. I'm sorry, regarding history. I think that's very important. And then I wrote down some other ones that to me were just stupid, like Ready Player One, My Hero Academia. This triggered me as a fellow horror fan, American Psycho. Although I would probably agree, kids probably shouldn't be reading that. And then in Texas, some books that are massively popular over time and actually have very important stories in them too, are banned. One is on Black America since MLK. There's one called They Called Themselves the KKK, the birth of an American terrorist group. So obviously you could see a little bit of a trend there. Even books like Fahrenheit 451 are banned over there. So to me, like, it's just something that it sounds good on paper, but when it's actually put out there in practice, it's a lot of just bullshit. And then there's stuff like keep men out of women's sports. It's like, okay, like, I think that the issue is a lot more complicated than just that, but I would agree with that on a base level. But then you get this one. Again, I've worn this shirt almost on every show, so I don't know if I would be included in this. Deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again. Okay, so first off, before I even get into my point on that, I also want to bring up a point that goes earlier in the book from Project 2025. It says, quote, defend our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to keep and bear arms. So you see that, and then you see down here, deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again. I mean, this is just the complete and utter blatant hypocrisy from the right when it comes to the freedom of speech issue. The ones that always bitch and moan and complain about cancel culture are the biggest cancel culture people when it comes to things like Israel. And it's just absolutely amazing to me. I mean, like, look, I saw there was some vandalism when Netanyahu spoke yesterday. First off, he should not be speaking to fucking Congress. We should, if they actually care about America first, we should actually prioritize our own citizens before a foreign nation that is what 1/5 of the size of California. But at the same time, like, there were people that definitely did go too far and that did some vandalism, and there were people that burned the American flag, which, I mean, look, I think that they should be allowed to. I don't know how much I would necessarily agree with that, going about doing that. But at the end of the day, like, to coin everybody that is an anti-genocide pro-Palestine protester as pro-Hamas, to me, is just disgusting. It's vile. It completely goes against freedom of speech itself. So again, these are just some of the issues. There's a lot more regarding such as electric vehicles and whatnot that I think that are much more takes a lot more time to kind of dive into. But just on the basis of some of these social issues, to me, it just gets into the blatant hypocrisy and gets into just some things that I think would be really unpopular with the American people. And that's why I think Trump has tried to distance himself from 2025, saying, I don't know what that is, even though his vice presidential candidate knows a lot about what it is, and a lot of the people that have primarily been in his administration prior know what this is. So overall, I want to pass it back over, and Dylan, I'll let you go ahead and go first this time. Regarding the social issues of Project 2025, just how dangerous would this just be on just the future of the country? And overall, do you think that if they run on this, actually, when it comes down to election time over these next few months, is this something that, despite if Harris does anything negative, that the Republicans can really win with an agenda like this?
Well, if you break it down into scenarios, so best case scenario, civil rights, women's rights, basically all of the rights get set back at least 50 years. Worst case scenario, the United States of America ceases to exist as the United States of America. It turns into something else. It turns into a authoritarian Christian nationalist state. So that in and of itself and alone should be enough to scare people. But a lot of people don't know enough about it. But with all of these, as you were saying, the social impacts, the hypocrisy is very real, as you noted, and just the people who are already marginalized will become even more marginalized, which is, obviously a bad thing. We want to move in the opposite direction of that. But there's just so many issues there. I think some of the freedom of religion implications haven't had enough attention brought to them. And we're already seeing some issues now with Oklahoma was one state. I forget the other. Was it Louisiana?
Yeah, we actually talked about
Louisiana.
that. We and actually Jackson are actually talking about that on part 2 of the podcast, the Oklahoma Bible and the Louisiana Ten Commandments. 100%.
I got you. I watched part 1 last night. I didn't watch part 2 yet. Kendrick's an old buddy of mine, so I had to see what he had to say. Anyway, and with with the other thing about it too is because I want to mention, you mentioned how at first Trump was trying to distance himself from it, right? Because he saw the backlash. Um, I think he's going in the opposite direction now since he chose JD Vance. I think, they just thought, you know what? We'll just double down on it and see if we can get enough of that kind of extremist support. So I was surprised when I saw that he picked JD Vance. I really thought he was going to do what he did in 2016 and try to pick someone more traditionally conservative as opposed to more extremist. I
I
mean,
thought it was going to be Nikki Haley or somebody like Tim Scott or something like that to
yeah,
balance it out.
exactly.
Yeah.
I really thought good chance for Tim Scott. Nikki Haley, that would have surprised me too, but not more than JD Vance. Um, with the Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare thing, there are proposed cuts to Social Security in there, specifically Social Security for people with disabilities, and that's going to have a huge that can have a huge domino effect in multiple areas. So if the people who are on that for disability lose that, whether it be physical disability, mental disability, a lot of them will be displaced. They'll lose their housing. And I don't see the far right lining up to build um, care facilities for people who have a mental disability or physical disability. So these people are going to become homeless. And then with the recent Supreme Court ruling on basically criminalizing homelessness, then that's going to send a lot of people to jail. People are going to die. So there's a huge social impact there that I don't think there's nearly enough attention being shined on. It goes after the most vulnerable people in our society and the
Even in
people
blue states, you're seeing homelessness being
oh
impacted.
yeah,
Like in California, Gavin
yeah,
Newsom came out and said they
Newsom
were going to
just
impact. Yeah.
yep, absolutely. So there's that too. Um, the tax thing is also um, something that I think people aren't going to fully understand for the reasons you already laid out about not understanding how the tax bracket works. And the thing about the people who advocate for that system of not that specific system, but to touch on what Jackson was saying about Reaganomics, basically, is it has the same inherent flaw that the idea of communism has. And that flaw is it relies on everyone acting ethically, everyone. And unfortunately, that's just not the world we live in. So the people who are inclined to take advantage of a system like that are going to still take advantage of it. I mean, if not, all of the relief corporations I've already gotten since the Eisenhower days, for example, that would have led to the betterment in the middle class, but obviously it didn't. So the socioeconomic impacts are going to be really huge, not just the stuff that people like to think of as like identity politics, like how it's going to affect people of different races, religions, sexual orientations. Obviously, that stuff's going to be really bad, but there's also some really bad economic things that are probably going to happen if Project 2025 really comes to be.
Yeah. And Jackson, I'll go ahead and throw it over to you. Same question for you. On the social impacts of this, and I know we got into a little bit of the economics there, but on just the social impacts of this in general, just what impact, how dangerous do you feel this would be for the country, and do you think that realistically, if it's framed in the right way, is this an agenda that the Republicans can win the national election over?
Right, and Dylan, you made a ton of great points there. I love that parallel you drew between Reaganomics and communism. But and like you said too, this really targets the most marginalized and people in the most precarious positions in our society already. Um, and I think just commenting on sort of the broader right wing media ecosystem and the state of right wing politics in our country, to me, this is the logical conclusion or the result of the accumulation and the increasing just the logical conclusion of this kind of sensationalism and hysteria that you saw in the late 90s and all throughout the 2000s and then up to today. And that's a big reason why Trump got elected. But people like Rush Limbaugh in the 90s who made their or Bill O'Reilly who made their sort of careers fear mongering to the right and sensationalizing culture war issues. This is where we are. We're at the point now where now it's a mainstream right wing. It's a part of the mainstream right wing policy agenda to I think, and a lot of it, especially the issues regarding trans rights or the LGBTQ community and the sensationalism around them as being, the right likes to, the most extreme elements of the right like to paint them as pedophiles, obviously completely unwarranted and unfounded in any kind of evidence whatsoever. But also DEI and critical race theory, they to me, these are all, they started off as dog whistles and now they're becoming foghorns. They're starting to say the quiet part out loud now with all these some of these beliefs that maybe were implicit before in the Republican Party, but they're now, Trump has emboldened them and shown them that you can at least have political success as Trump proved in 2016, which there's a lot of things have changed since then, but Trump proved to them that you can be brazen and open about some of this racism and transphobia, homophobia, and still have a place in our politics, which you shouldn't. But that's trans people make up such a minority of our population. It's a small fraction of our population, and yet there's such a hysteria, and it's painted as such a pressing problem and a threat to our children. Think about how manipulative and fear mongering that point is on the right of trans people are a threat to your children, and that's a way that you can package sort of these transphobic and homophobic ideas and get people to get behind them if you prey on their fears of the unknown, the fears of people that are different than them.
Well, and it's also funny that I'm sorry for interrupting real quick. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
But just as a quick note on that, it's funny you mentioned about people saying trans people being a threat to children. There was an interview that Elon Musk did with Dr. Jordan Peterson that came out I think over the last day, where he basically said that his male son is dead to him from the woke mind virus because he's chosen to transition. Well, I mean, I'm sorry. What's more dangerous? You saying that trans people are more are dangerous to children, or are you more dangerous to your trans kid because you don't even view him as a human being anymore when he's your own flesh and blood? Like, I'm not saying that's everybody who's going to have a trans person in their life, but like, if we're extrapolating off of that and saying that this if that people are going to say that that is the woke mind virus, other people that believe in that, if they're at least some of the contingent that believes in that would disown a person, that's more dangerous to me than any potential thing that could happen.
100%.
Right, you're absolutely right, and trans people are one of the groups in our country that have the highest suicide rates. They're at the highest risk of being bullied or having violence done upon them because of a lot of these narratives that are propagated of them being a grave existential threat. And it's horrifying, and it goes against everything that we are supposed to believe, and we're supposed to be the leader of the free world and a beacon of hope and democracy for the world, and yet we're stuck in these archaic Christian nationalist politics on at least a large portion of our right wing is now. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just the most brazen hypocrisy for them to have claimed for so long to be staunch supporters of free speech, and then at the same time want to ban books that they view as even remotely acknowledging America's history of racism and the way that it still affects communities of color today. That isn't disputable. There are hard numbers to back up the wealth disparities between Black and white Americans, people of color, and wealthy white Americans. They simply did not have the generational wealth accumulation that the ruling white class effectively has had for
And
hundreds
to
of
just
years.
draw a comparison on that real quick too, to ban books like to talk about racism in this country and the history we've had are like, and by the way, I think that they probably would ban these over there as well to draw a perfect comparison. It's like over in Israel saying we're going to ban a book or ban a documentary that actually talks about the history of Palestine. And because then you actually have to learn about what your country did to a group of people, and then you actually have to live with the facts of, hey, we actually did do that. Okay, what are the policy changes? And then obviously you get into the reparation side of thing and all of that kind of stuff. And to me, it's just funny because we need to just stop calling it critical race theory. I fucking hate that term, and just call it what it is: history.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's a subject that's like, I remember being in high school. I had a history teacher who tried to tell us that slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War.
Hmm.
Like, that's that's not accurate.
Right.
I mean, every single contributing factor to the Civil War traces back to slavery. Like people who try to say states' rights. Well, a state's right to do what?
And these
State's
are the
right to
same
have
people.
slavery.
These are the same people that claim to say that the public education system fails our students. Well, who do you think's fucking
Right.
blamed for that shit?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
And
You know.
there's things like in a lot of this stuff, the systemic racism stuff that they don't want people to learn about. It's not even like you can make the argument of, well, it happened in the 1700s, so it's not relevant to kids now. It's like, no, a lot of this happened within the last 100 years. Like even like the GI Bill after World War II, where they were going to build houses for all the GIs. Well, those Levitt towns that they promoted, those were only for the white people. They wouldn't let any of the black soldiers move into those. They built the projects for them instead. So the systemic racism in housing is, it's not that it's something that just happened in like the 1700s. Like this was actively promoted as recent as World War II. There's still towns out there who don't enforce the rule anymore, but have it written in their laws that black people aren't allowed to own homes there. They never actually removed the language. So this isn't stuff that's ancient. This is